Hi guys, Ellie here from the garden, and today I'm working on a bit of a project. So this project stems from the fact that we do indeed have a small-ish garden. So our problem on our property currently is that we don't actually have a large enough space to warrant a full composting system. So we've had to find a way to be creative and put together a composting system that works for us. And for us, that was the worm bin. So we actually have a worm farm, and it generally is Duncan's indaba. I don't interfere, but it's gotten to the point where it is becoming one of the tools that is necessary for the garden for me, and a skill that I probably should learn myself. So in my indaba to feed my garden, I have decided that I need to understand how the worm bin works so that I can make the best and most efficient use out of it. I don't only like to read through the theory, I like to have some sort of practice. So what I've done is I've come up with a way to teach myself, and hopefully you guys can learn along with me on how to farm my own worms in the hope of getting some worm tea to fertilize my garden. Right, so while I enjoy my coffee, I thought I would continue on with explaining what the idea is. As a small space gardener, I've just been thinking constantly, how can I replenish my soil from my own home if I don't have the space to create large composting bins, because they either take up too much space or we just don't have the space available, or the resources to replenish that particular compost bin. Like, it would take too long to generate the compost that it wouldn't be worth it at the moment. So I'd been doing a little bit of research into ways to make compost at home, and there are many different ways you could try. You could try a bokashi bin, you could turn some of your food scraps into teas and feed that back to your garden. You could worm compost, or you could compost. So I don't want to spend a lot of money, but I do want to learn. So what I decided to do was do some research into the worms, because we already had a worm bin, thinking I would upgrade that system and we would be okay. And then I realized I actually don't know how to upgrade the system because I don't understand how the system works. So this is my attempt at teaching myself a little bit more about worms whilst upskilling my worm knowledge, so that I can use this to make a better functioning system over there to produce what we require for our garden. And in doing so, this will allow me to see if it's possible to create some worm tea fertilizer for gardens in a much smaller scale, so that maybe balcony gardeners could also give it a shot and benefit from what is happening in here. So this is the general plan. It is a much smaller scale worm tower. I've seen worm towers done, I think they say in 15-gallon buckets, but these are 5-liter buckets, and it requires 3 buckets. Your first bucket, yes, they're dirty, I will give them a clean, will stay whole, and this will be the vessel that catches your worm tea. Then you will have a secondary bucket, and you will have drilled holes into the bottom of it. I was fortunate enough that Duncan drilled these holes for me, and he cleaned them up nicely so that the worms wouldn't be caught on things, and I'll explain that to you now. This bucket will then go in here. We will line it with some cardboard and put worm bedding in and our worms, and they will essentially create their worm castings in this particular container. Then you'll have your third container, also with holes drilled in it, and that will then go on top of that, leaving a slight gap on the side here for breathing, as it's raised by the medium on the inside. And then this would be where you would put your food scraps or your plant scraps, whatever you are feeding your worms. and they would essentially then migrate from the bedding section up into this compost bucket. And when this middle bucket is then full, you can then take it out and empty it, use it to top dress a container or feed your garden. Your composting bucket would then fall down, that would then come back on the top of it, and the cycle would then continue. And as the worms break down and compost the scraps that you feed them, that moisture would drip into the bottom of your tower, and this you would dilute and feed it back to your plants as a liquid fertilizer. It is done in varying different ratios, but a lot of the time they say 1 part worm tea to 10 parts water, but that is up to you. So that is the general idea, and like I said, I am new to this, so this is as new to me as it may be to some of you. Some of you may be more experienced, and I welcome some constructive criticism. And we're going to attempt at making our own little worm tower in a more compact form. That being said, I have been told that by shrinking it down to a smaller size, it may require a lot more maintenance because there's less volume for the worms to work through. Okay guys, so let's get started. So when you are drilling your holes into your bucket, it is just important for you to be mindful that you do need to go back and remove any excess plastic that is still attached and maybe creating a sharp edge, not only for your own safety but for that of the worms too. So I'm going to bring it a little bit closer, and over here you can see that there's actually a piece of plastic that is still attached to the bucket over here and could potentially snag on a little worm or something, and we don't want to cause them any harm, so we want to make this as pleasant an experience as possible. Duncan's already done this for one of the buckets for me, and I just have this one to do. So I'm going to go around and cut off these sharp little edges so that hopefully we aren't harming any little wormies. Okay, so I'm essentially going to start building the very first layer of our worm bin that sits in the catchment bucket, the worm tea bucket. Now you're supposed to put a layer of cardboard down here first. I don't have a layer of cardboard, but I do have this brown paper shopping bag. And I've traced a rough circle over here, so I'm just going to cut it out. So I'm going to take a circle, and drop it into our bucket, and then I'm going to start filling this bucket with things we have lying around that would constitute as worm bedding. Right, so in this little bucket I'm going to make our bedding mixture. I am going to mix it up, and that's why I'm doing it in this little container. The first thing I have to add is this dried up old leaf litter. And to that I'm going to be using some compost. as well as some crushed up eggshell for grit. Right, so in this little bucket over here, I have got some potting mix, some compost, some calcium in the form of ground up eggshells, and some leaf litter, and this should make a good bedding for our worms. We're essentially going to layer some of this into our bucket that we've already got ready here, and then we're going to add a layer of worms, and then we're going to add another layer of bedding. Alright, so over here is our current worm burn situation, and as you can see, it has got scraps in it and some really beautiful soil available to be used. There are some beautiful worms in this soil, and I think I've got what I need. So I'm just going to seal this back up. Alright, so in this tub we've got our piece of brown paper and our soil mix, and I'm going to just add a layer of bedding. And I'm going to add a layer of worms. I'm not sure if you can see this, but here's a little worm and here's a little worm. And another layer of that bedding. So now I'm going to start assembling my bucket. I've got my empty at the bottom that will hopefully catch our worm tea. Our worm bedding going in, about half the bucket is full. Then on top of that I'm going to add in our second bucket and start adding in here. There is a gap along the top here, and that is for airflow. And we're going to start our actual composting in this section of the container. So I've just watered our bedding here a little bit with the rainwater we've captured out of our JoJo, and that is just to ensure that the soil remains moist. And then in the top buckets I have our garden scraps and a little bit of bedding as well, so that when the worms are ready they have something to expand into, and they would essentially creep up into the second bucket to come and fetch their food, which we will constantly be refilling with kitchen scraps. So now it's just a question of how quickly the worms are going to be able to work through this, so we're going to keep an eye on that. But for now we need to find it a space to live. Alright guys, so I've decided I'm going to put my worm tower here. It is right by my kitchen door, so if I have any kitchen scraps I can just come outside and add them to our little buckets. They are outside next to our outdoor dustbin and in our container area. So I think for now this will be a good home for the worms. They do get a little bit of sunlight, but for the most part they are in the shade, so they shouldn't struggle too much. So we'll track its progress and I'll keep you up to date. And I just wanted to say thanks for hanging out with me while I try another crazy experiment in the garden. It can only help, and remember, every little bit counts. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share across your social media platforms. It really goes a long way in getting our name out there and making our dreams possible. Have a fantastic weekend, guys. Bye.